The fist connected with a sickening crack that echoed across the fort compound, despite the howling wind and swirling snow. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her gloved hand pressed against her racing heart as she watched Benjamin Carter drive his knuckles into Lieutenant Morrison's jaw with savage precision. Morrison staggered backward, blood spraying across the fresh Arizona snow, and Emma couldn't tear her eyes away from the man defending her honor with such fierce, protective fury. Benjamin's steel-gray eyes blazed with a rage she'd never seen in any man, his sandy brown hair wild with snow. His cavalry jacket hanging open as if the late winter cold meant nothing compared to the heat of his anger. When he looked back at her to make sure she was unharmed, that split second of concern in the middle of a fight, something inside Emma's chest cracked open, like spring ice on a frozen river. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She was a mail-order bride, promised to Captain Richard Thornton, a man she'd never met, who was currently away on patrol. Benjamin was forbidden. He was her fiancé's second-in-command. He was the one man at Fort McDowell she absolutely could not want. And yet, watching him defend her against Morrison's drunken advances, seeing the controlled violence in every punch, the way his muscles moved beneath his white shirt now soaked with melting snow, Emma felt something dangerous, an intoxicating unfurl in her belly. This was desire. This was want. This was everything she'd been taught a proper woman shouldn't feel. Morrison lunged again, throwing a wild punch that Benjamin dodged easily, his military training evident in every efficient movement. The other soldiers had formed a circle around them now, but no one intervened. Morrison had crossed a line, had grabbed Emma's arm and made a crude suggestion when she'd been walking back from the sutler's store. Benjamin had appeared out of the blizzard like an avenging angel, and Morrison had been fool enough to laugh and say something about sharing the captain's mail-order goods. The words had barely left his lips before Benjamin's fist had found his face. Now, as Emma watched, Benjamin landed another devastating blow to Morrison's ribs, then followed with an uppercut that dropped the lieutenant into the snow. Morrison stayed down this time, groaning and spitting blood. Benjamin stood over him, chest heaving, knuckles split and bleeding, snow settling on his broad shoulders. His voice, when he spoke, was deadly calm. "You will apologize to Miss Emma. Then you will report yourself to the stockade. If I ever hear you speak of her, or any woman with such disrespect again, I will finish what I started here." Morrison mumbled something that might have been an apology through his split lip. Benjamin's eyes never left him until two other soldiers hauled Morrison to his feet and led him away. Only then did Benjamin turn to Emma, and the fury in his face transformed into something softer, something that made her knees weak. "Are you hurt?" His voice was gentle now, so different from the cold rage of moments before. Emma shook her head, unable to find words. She'd been at Fort McDowell for only 3 weeks, waiting for Captain Thornton to return from patrol so they could marry. In that time, she learned that Benjamin Carter was respected by every soldier, feared by some, and admired by all. He was Thornton's most trusted officer, a man who'd fought in the Indian Wars and survived battles that left him with scars he never talked about. He kept to himself, spoke little, and never attended the social gatherings the fort wives organized. Until Emma had arrived, she'd learned he'd been planning to leave the army, to disappear into the wilderness like so many ex-soldiers did when the war inside their heads became too loud. Now he stepped closer, his hand reaching toward her arm where Morrison had grabbed her, then stopping just short of touching her, propriety winning out over instinct. "Did he hurt you?" Benjamin asked, his steel-gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her flush despite the cold. Snow caught in his sandy brown hair, melted on his weathered tan skin, and Emma found herself noticing details she shouldn't notice about a man who wasn't hers. The way his close-trimmed beard emphasized his strong jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his arms that had just defended her with such controlled violence. She was staring. She knew she was staring. And worse, he knew it too, because something shifted in his expression. A flash of awareness that made the space between them feel charged like the air before a lightning strike. "No," Emma finally managed, her voice barely audible above the wind. "You stopped him before he could." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. How did you thank a man for fighting for your honor? How did you express what it meant to see someone willing to bleed for you, to risk discipline and punishment, simply because another man had treated you with disrespect? Benjamin's jaw tightened, and he stepped back, putting proper distance between them again. "You shouldn't be out in this storm alone," he said, his voice carefully neutral now. The moment of connection shuttering closed. "Let me escort you back to your quarters." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Emma took it. The contact, even through layers of wool and leather, sent warmth racing through her body that had nothing to do with escaping the cold. They walked across the fort compound in silence, snow swirling around them, and Emma was achingly aware of his presence beside her. The way he matched his stride to hers, how he positioned himself on her windward side, blocking the worst of the storm. The careful propriety with which he held his arm, close enough to steady her on the icy ground, but not so close as to be improper. When they reached the small cabin that had been assigned to her, Benjamin released her arm immediately and stepped back. "You should get inside and warm up," he said. "I'll make sure Morrison is properly disciplined." He turned to leave, but Emma's voice stopped him. "Your hands." She nodded toward his split knuckles, still bleeding, the skin already swelling. "You should let me tend them. Please, it's the least I can do." Benjamin looked down at his hands as if he'd forgotten about them, then back at her face. For a long moment, she thought he would refuse. Every rule of propriety said he should refuse. An unmarried woman alone with a man who wasn't her fiancé, behind closed doors, was scandalous enough. But tending to his injuries, touching him, being that close, was the kind of intimacy that led to gossip and ruin. Emma knew this. Benjamin certainly knew this. And yet, when he finally nodded and followed her inside the cabin, they both knew they were crossing a line from which there might be no return. The cabin was small, but comfortable, assigned to Emma as the captain's intended bride. It had a wood-burning stove, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and little else. Emma had added what touches she could. Curtains she'd sewn from fabric bought at the sutler's store, a quilt her mother had made, wild flowers she'd pressed between the pages of her Bible. Benjamin stood just inside the door, looking like he wanted to bolt, melting snow dripping from his coat onto the rough wooden floor. Emma busied herself poking life into the fire, adding wood, trying to calm her racing heart. "Sit," she said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Let me get water and clean cloth." She didn't wait for his response, moving with purpose to hide her nervousness. When she returned with her small medical kit and a basin of water she'd heated on the stove, Benjamin had removed his cavalry jacket and was sitting rigidly in the chair, looking profoundly uncomfortable. His white shirt was damp from melted snow, clinging to his chest and arms in ways that made Emma's mouth go dry. She'd grown up on a farm in Missouri, had 5 brothers, and wasn't naive about male bodies. But there was something about Benjamin Carter that made her feel like a girl again, uncertain and electric with awareness. She knelt beside him, and he immediately started to protest. "Miss Emma, you shouldn't kneel. Let me." But Emma shook her head, already reaching for his injured hand. "I'm tending your wounds, not paying you homage, Mr. Carter. Please sit still." The moment her fingers touched his, carefully turning his hand to examine the damage, the air in the small cabin seemed to thicken. His hands were large, calloused from years of military service, scarred from battles and labor. The knuckles on his right hand were split open, swelling already forming, and she could feel how he was trying to hold perfectly still beneath her touch. Emma cleaned the blood away gently, and Benjamin didn't flinch, even though she knew it must hurt. "You didn't have to fight him," she said softly, not looking up from her work. "I could have reported him to the captain when he returns." Benjamin's voice, when he answered, was rough. What he said, what he tried to do, couldn't wait for the captain's return. Some things a man answers for immediately. Emma dipped the cloth in clean water, wrung it out, continued her careful ministrations. "And if you'd been disciplined for fighting, if they'd put you in the stockade instead of Morrison?" She felt him shift slightly, and when she glanced up, his steel-gray eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. "It would have been worth it," Benjamin said simply. "You deserve to feel safe here, to be treated with respect." What he did was unforgivable. The way he said it, the absolute certainty in his voice, made Emma's throat tight. In her 27 years, she learned that most men's protective instincts extended only as far as their own property and pride. Her father had defended his daughters because they were his daughters, his responsibility, his to defend. Her late husband had protected her because she was his wife, an extension of himself. But Benjamin had defended her because it was right. Because she deserved respect as a person, not because she belonged to him or anyone else. Emma began wrapping his knuckles with clean cloth, trying to focus on the task and not on how close they were, how the firelight played across his weathered features, how his chest rose and fell with each controlled breath. "Why did you really stop him?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Tell me the truth." Benjamin was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his free hand, the one she wasn't bandaging, lifted slowly and tucked a honey-blonde strand of hair that had escaped her pins behind her ear. The gesture was achingly gentle and entirely inappropriate, and Emma froze, her hands still wrapped around his injured one. "Because," Benjamin said, his voice barely above a whisper, "from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. And the thought of any man treating you with anything less than the reverence you deserve makes me want to break things, starting with his face." The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous and electric. Emma should stand up, should finish bandaging his hand, send him away, pretend this conversation never happened. She was promised to Captain Thornton. Benjamin was Thornton's officer, his friend, his trusted second. This attraction, this want, was wrong. It was forbidden. It threatened everything: her security, her future, her very survival in this harsh territory where a woman alone had few options. But Emma didn't stand up. Instead, she met Benjamin's eyes and let him see the truth in hers. "I've been thinking about you too," she whispered. "I shouldn't, but I can't seem to stop." Benjamin's hand, the one that had touched her hair, dropped away like he'd been burned. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the chair, putting distance between them. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice harsh now. "That was inappropriate. You're the captain's intended. I had no right to say that, to touch you. It won't happen again." But even as he said the words, even as he grabbed his coat and moved toward the door, Emma could see the lie in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. It would happen again. This pull between them was too strong, too inevitable. They both knew it. As Benjamin opened the door, letting in a blast of cold wind and swirling snow, he paused and looked back at her. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and in that moment, Emma saw her own conflict mirrored in his face. The war between duty and desire, honor and want, what they should do, and what they desperately wanted to do. Then he was gone, closing the door firmly behind him. And Emma was alone with her racing heart and the knowledge that everything had just changed. She'd come to Arizona territory as a mail-order bride, seeking security and a fresh start after her husband's death had left her penniless. She'd answered Captain Thornton's advertisement because it offered safety, respectability, a home. She'd expected duty, companionship, perhaps eventually affection. She hadn't expected Benjamin Carter, hadn't expected to feel desire again after 2 years of widowhood, hadn't expected her carefully constructed plans to crumble at the touch of a man's hand and the honesty in his steel-gray eyes. Emma sank into the chair Benjamin had vacated, still warm from his body, and pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. Outside, the late winter storm continued to rage, snow piling against the walls and windows. But inside, Emma felt like spring had arrived early, thawing something in her chest that had been frozen since the day they'd buried her husband. It was dangerous. It was foolish. It was impossible. And yet, as she looked at the strips of cloth still sitting on the table, spotted with Benjamin's blood, Emma knew with absolute certainty that she was already lost. The question wasn't whether she wanted Benjamin Carter. The question was what she was willing to sacrifice to have him. The days that followed that afternoon in the blizzard were an exercise in exquisite torture. Emma went about her daily routines at the fort, learning to cook on the wood-burning stove, sewing and mending, helping the other women with their children, attending Sunday services in the small chapel, and trying desperately not to think about Benjamin Carter. She failed spectacularly. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost that haunted her thoughts even when he wasn't physically present. And when he was present, when their paths crossed in the fort compound or at communal meals, the tension between them was so palpable, Emma was certain everyone could see it. But if the other residents of Fort McDowell noticed anything unusual, they said nothing. Perhaps they attributed Emma's flushed cheeks and distraction to nerves about her upcoming wedding. Captain Thornton was expected back within the month, and preparations were already underway for the ceremony that would make Emma his wife. Benjamin kept his distance. He was scrupulously proper on the rare occasions they encountered each other, addressing her as Miss Emma with perfect military courtesy, never letting his eyes linger, never standing close enough for their hands to accidentally brush. It should have made things easier. Instead, it made everything worse. Emma found herself watching for him, looking for any excuse to walk past the officers' quarters or the training grounds where he drilled soldiers. She learned his routines the way a spy learns enemy patterns. Morning inspection at 7, training until noon, lunch in the officers' mess, afternoon duties that varied, evening reports. She told herself she was being foolish, that this obsession was dangerous, but her eyes sought him anyway, hungry for glimpses of his strong profile, the way he moved with such controlled power, the rare moments when he smiled at something one of his men said. The Fort wives, sensing Emma's loneliness and taking pity on the mail-order bride waiting for her groom, drew her into their circle. Mrs. Patterson, the Fort commander's wife, was a kind woman who organized sewing circles and tried to bring culture to the frontier. She took Emma under her wing, introducing her to the other women, teaching her the social hierarchies and expectations of Fort life. Through Mrs. Patterson, Emma learned more about Benjamin than she could have discovered on her own. She learned he'd enlisted at 17, had fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Indian Wars, had been decorated multiple times for bravery. She learned he'd been engaged once, years ago, to a girl back in Ohio, but she'd broken it off when he'd extended his service rather than returning home. She learned he was known as a man of honor, someone soldiers would follow into hell itself, but also as someone with demons that haunted his sleep and kept him apart from easy companionship. One afternoon, while helping Mrs. Patterson bake bread for the Easter celebration, Emma worked up the courage to ask about Captain Thornton, the man she was supposed to marry. Mrs. Patterson's hands stilled briefly in the dough before resuming their kneading rhythm. "Richard Thornton is a good man," she said carefully. "Honorable. Fair. He'll provide well for you." Emma noticed what she didn't say. Warm, affectionate, kind. The words Mrs. Patterson chose were the same ones you might use to describe a reliable horse. "Has he been married before?" Emma asked, realizing she knew almost nothing about the man who'd sent for her. Mrs. Patterson nodded. His first wife died 5 years ago, in childbirth. The baby didn't survive either. Richard threw himself into his military service afterward. This is the first time he's shown any interest in remarrying. She gave Emma a sympathetic look. "I think he wants the comfort of companionship. Someone to manage his household. Don't expect romance, dear." Richard had that once. This time he's looking for something more practical. The words should have been comforting. Emma had expected practical when she'd responded to Thornton's advertisement. Romance, passion, the kind of love poets wrote about, those were luxuries for young girls with dowries and prospects. Widows nearing 30 with no money and no family had to be realistic. But hearing it said so baldly, understanding that Thornton wanted a housekeeper more than a wife, a companion more than a lover, made something rebel in Emma's chest. Was that really all she deserved? Was that all life had left to offer her? Then she thought of Benjamin's hands on her face, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and rare, and her throat tightened with frustrated longing. That afternoon, as Emma left the commander's quarters with a basket of fresh bread for her cabin, she nearly collided with Benjamin on the steps. He caught her elbow to steady her, and even through the layers of her coat and dress, his touch burned. "Forgive me," he said immediately, releasing her and stepping back. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, everything else faded away. The fort, the watching eyes, the impossibility of their situation. All of it disappeared, and there was only this, the two of them. The spring sun warm on their faces, the Arizona sky brilliant blue overhead, and the undeniable current that flowed between them. Then voices approached, and the moment shattered. Benjamin took another step back, his face carefully neutral. "Miss Emma," he said formally, tipping his hat. "Please give my regards to Mrs. Patterson." And he was gone, striding away with that efficient military pace, leaving Emma standing on the steps trying to calm her racing heart. She wanted to scream, wanted to chase after him, and demand to know if he felt this same desperate, impossible pull. Wanted to ask him what they were going to do, how they could possibly survive this attraction when every rule of society and honor said it was wrong. But she did none of those things. She went back to her cabin, put away the bread, and sat down at her small table with the bundle of letters she'd been avoiding. The letters were from Captain Richard Thornton, written during his patrol and delivered by military courier. Emma had received 6 of them in the 3 weeks since her arrival, and she'd read each one exactly once. They were perfectly proper, well-written, and utterly devoid of any real emotion. Thornton described the landscape, the progress of his patrol, the condition of his men. He expressed satisfaction that she'd arrived safely and was settling in at the fort. He looked forward to meeting her upon his return and formalizing their arrangement. He signed each letter, "Respectfully, Captain Richard Thornton." Never yours. Never even sincerely. Just respectfully. Like she was a business associate rather than the woman he intended to marry. Emma picked up her pen and tried to compose a response, but the words wouldn't come. What was she supposed to write? That she was grateful for his offer of marriage, but found herself desperately attracted to his second-in-command? That she appreciated his respectful letters, but wished they contained even a hint of warmth? That she was terrified she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life by marrying a man she didn't love, simply because it was practical and safe? Instead, she wrote a brief, polite response, thanking him for his letters and expressing hope for his safe return. She signed it, "Respectfully, Emma Whitfield," matching his distant formality. As she sealed the letter, a knock at her door made her jump. When she opened it, she found Private Henderson, one of the younger soldiers, standing there with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "Begging your pardon, Miss Emma," he said, "but Lieutenant Carter asked me to deliver this to you." He held out a small wooden box, beautifully carved with delicate patterns of leaves and flowers. Emma took it with trembling hands. "Thank you, Private." When she was alone again, Emma opened the box and found inside a collection of pressed wildflowers, each one carefully labeled in Benjamin's neat handwriting. Desert marigold, Arizona poppy, purple owl's clover, golden columbine. Tucked beneath them was a small note in that same precise script. "Spring is coming to the desert. I thought you might like to see what it brings. These will bloom around the fort in the coming weeks." There was no signature, but Emma would have known his handwriting anywhere. She'd seen it on duty rosters and reports displayed in the commander's office. She sank onto her bed, holding the box like it was something sacred, and felt tears prick her eyes. The gift was innocent enough that if anyone had seen it, they could attribute it to simple kindness. A soldier welcoming the captain's bride to Arizona. But Emma knew better. This was Benjamin's way of speaking to her when words between them had become impossible. He was showing her the beauty of this harsh landscape, sharing something he loved, giving her a piece of himself disguised as wildflowers. Over the following days, Emma watched those flowers begin to appear around the fort, exactly as Benjamin had promised. The desert, so harsh and forbidding in winter, transformed into something magical as spring took hold. Purple and gold bloomed between the sage and mesquite. The air grew warmer, carrying scents of creosote and wild verbena. Snow melted from the distant mountains, and the usually dry creek bed behind the fort began to run with clear water. Emma found herself taking long walks, exploring this new landscape. And, though she told herself she was simply enjoying the spring weather, some part of her hoped she might encounter Benjamin away from the watching eyes of the fort. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, a week after he'd sent the flowers. Emma had walked farther than usual, following the creek upstream to where it formed a small pool beneath a stand of cottonwood trees, just beginning to leaf out. The spot was peaceful, hidden from the fort by a rise in the land, and Emma sat on a sun-warmed rock, listening to the water, and trying to sort through the tangle of her thoughts. She didn't hear Benjamin approach. So quiet were his steps, trained by years of tracking and warfare. When his voice came from behind her, she nearly fell off the rock in surprise. "This isn't safe," he said, and she turned to find him standing at the edge of the trees, his steel gray eyes intense. "You shouldn't come this far from the fort alone. There are still Apache raiding parties in the area." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, but not from fear of Apache raiders. Benjamin wore civilian clothes today. Simple dark trousers and a white shirt open at the throat. His cavalry jacket and military bearing left behind. His sandy brown hair was slightly longer than regulation, curling at his collar, and with the beard emphasizing his strong jaw and the spring sun bringing out the tan in his weathered skin, he looked more like a frontiersman than a soldier. Dangerous. Beautiful. Forbidden. "I didn't go far," Emma said, finding her voice. "I can still see the fort from that rise." She pointed, though they both knew she was making excuses. She'd come here hoping he might find her. She'd wanted this, wanted him, wanted to break the terrible distance that propriety had forced between them. Benjamin came closer but stopped several feet away, maintaining that careful space he always kept between them in public. But here, with no witnesses except the cottonwoods and the singing water, that space felt like a chasm Emma wanted desperately to cross. "Did you like the flowers?" he asked quietly. "I did," Emma said. "They're beautiful. Thank you." They stood there, the creek babbling between them, all the words they couldn't say hanging in the warm spring air. Finally, Benjamin broke the silence. "The captain returns in 10 days. The wedding is planned for 2 days after his arrival." End quote. It wasn't a question, but Emma nodded anyway, her throat suddenly tight. "Mrs. Patterson has been helping me prepare. She's lending me her wedding dress." Benjamin's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Are you happy about the marriage?" The question was dangerous, crossing every line of propriety. But Emma found she was tired of propriety, tired of pretending, tired of the careful dance they'd been doing for weeks. "No," she admitted, the word escaping like a confession. "I'm not happy. I'm grateful for the security it offers, and I'm sure Captain Thornton is a good man. But I don't love him. I don't even know him." Benjamin took a step closer, then another, until only a few feet separated them. "Then why are you going through with it?" His voice was rough, urgent. "Because what choice do I have?" Emma's words came out more sharply than she intended, frustration and longing making her voice crack. "I'm a widow with no money and no family. I can't go back to Missouri." There's nothing left for me there. When my husband died, his debts consumed everything. I sold my wedding ring to buy the stagecoach ticket here. This marriage is survival, Mr. Carter, not romance. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm afternoon. I answered Captain Thornton's advertisement because I have no other options. That's what women in my position do. We make practical choices, not romantic ones. Benjamin closed the distance between them in 2 strides, and suddenly, he was right there. So close Emma could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, could smell the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. What if you had another option? His voice was low, intense, and his hands came up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her eyes burn. What if someone else wanted to offer you security in a home? Someone who can't stop thinking about you? Who would spend the rest of his life making sure you never regretted choosing him? Emma's breath caught. Benjamin, she whispered, using his given name for the first time, and something in his expression cracked at the sound of it on her lips. I have money saved, he continued, words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back too long. Not much, but enough to buy land, start a ranch. I've been planning to leave the army for months, even before you arrived. I'm done with fighting, done with killing. I want to build something instead of destroying. I want peace. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones, the touch achingly tender. But more than any of that, I want you. I know it's selfish. I know Thornton is my captain, my friend. I know you came here as his bride, but I can't watch you marry him without telling you that you have a choice. You could choose me instead. The world seemed to stop. Birds ceased singing. The creek fell silent. Emma's entire being focused down to this moment, this man, this impossible choice he was offering. Your captain, she whispered. Your friend. What would choosing you cost? Your career? Your honor? His friendship? Benjamin's expression was stark, honest. Everything. It would cost everything. Thornton would have every right to call me out, to challenge me or demand I face court-martial for this betrayal. The army would likely discharge me dishonorably. We'd have to leave this territory, start over somewhere no one knows us, live with the scandal and the whispers. He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. But I would pay that cost. I would give up everything I've built, every shred of honor and reputation I've earned. If it meant having you, if it meant not spending the rest of my life watching you belong to someone else. Emma closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks onto his hands. She'd been raised to value duty and honor above personal desire. Her mother had taught her that a woman's virtue lay in her ability to sacrifice her own wants for the greater good. She'd married her first husband, not for love, but because it was expected, because he was suitable, and her father approved. That marriage had been comfortable, but passionless. And when her husband died, Emma had mourned more for the security she'd lost than for the man himself. Coming to Arizona as a mail-order bride had been another practical choice, another sacrifice of her own desires for survival. But standing here in Benjamin's hands, feeling the intensity of his emotion, being offered something real and raw and dangerous, Emma wondered for the first time in her life what it might be like to choose differently. To choose passion over practicality. To choose the man who made her heart race instead of the one who offered safety. to choose herself, her own happiness, even if it meant scandal and struggle. "I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for me," Emma said, opening her eyes to meet his. "It's too much. The cost is too high." Benjamin's smile was sad and beautiful. "You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference." He released her face and stepped back, giving her space, giving her the choice without pressure. "I won't push you. I won't speak of this again unless you want me to. If you decide to marry Thornton, I'll leave the fort before the wedding, and you'll never have to see me again. But I needed you to know that you're not trapped, that you have options, that someone sees you, Emma, not as a housekeeper or a convenience, but as a woman worth upending an entire life for." He turned to walk away, but Emma's voice stopped him. "Wait." When he looked back, she was standing now, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "If I chose you, where would we go? What would we do?" Hope flickered across Benjamin's face, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "I've been looking at land south of here, near Tucson. There's a valley with good water and grazing land. Remote enough that scandal might not follow us. Close enough to town that we wouldn't be completely isolated. I could raise horses, maybe cattle. You could." He paused, realizing he knew almost nothing about her skills or dreams, beyond the basic facts of her widowhood. "I can manage a household," Emma offered, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the conversation. "I can cook, sew, garden, preserve food, tend animals. I can read and write. I can shoot a rifle reasonably well, though I'm better with a shotgun." She'd learned all of that on her family's farm in Missouri, skills her mother had insisted every frontier woman needed. "I'm strong, Mr. Carter. Stronger than I look. I've survived worse than scandal and hard work." Benjamin's eyes lit with something that looked like admiration mixed with desire. "I don't doubt it. From the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, travel-worn and exhausted but standing straight with your chin up, I knew you were strong. That's part of what drew me to you." He took a tentative step back toward her. "I can't offer you comfort or ease, Emma. Life on a ranch would be harder than life as a captain's wife on a fort. There would be no servants, no social gatherings, no security of military pay, but I can promise you that every day I would choose you. Every day I would work to build something we could both be proud of. And every night I would hold you and be grateful you trusted me enough to take this risk." The picture he painted was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. Emma tried to imagine herself on some remote ranch, working alongside Benjamin from sunup to sundown, building a life from nothing. No safety net of military community, no social standing or respectability, just the two of them against the harsh Arizona landscape, with nothing but their skills and determination, and whatever this powerful attraction between them might become. It should have sent her running back to the safety of Captain Thornton's practical proposal. Instead, it made something wild and hopeful unfurl in Emma's chest, like those spring flowers breaking through the desert floor. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is too important, too life-changing to decide in a moment of emotion." Benjamin nodded, accepting her answer with a grace that made her heart ache. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Emma?" He waited until she met his eyes. "Whatever you decide, know that I meant every word. You're not alone. You're not without choices." and you deserve to be loved, not just accommodated." Then he was walking away, leaving Emma standing by the creek with her entire future hanging in the balance. She watched him disappear over the rise toward the fort, and only when he was out of sight did she let herself sink back onto the sun-warmed rock and press her shaking hands to her face. Her mind spun in circles, weighing options, calculating risks, trying to be rational, when everything inside her screamed to chase after Benjamin and tell him yes to everything he offered. But rationality was what had gotten her here in the first place. Rationality was what had made her respond to Captain Thornton's advertisement, travel across the country to marry a stranger, accept a loveless but secure future. Maybe, Emma thought as the afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwoods and painted the world in gold, maybe rationality wasn't the answer this time. Maybe, for once in her carefully controlled life, she needed to listen to her heart instead of her head. The question was whether she had the courage to actually do it. That night, Emma lay in her narrow bed, unable to sleep, her mind replaying every moment with Benjamin. The way he'd looked at her in the snowstorm, fierce and protective. The gentleness of his hands when she'd tended his wounds. The vulnerability in his voice when he'd confessed his feelings. The picture he'd painted of a life they could build together. Hard but honest. Poor but rich in the ways that mattered. She thought about Captain Thornton too, though she'd never met him. Tried to imagine herself as his wife, managing his household, attending military functions at his side, sharing his bed with polite but passionless duty, growing old in comfortable but empty companionship. It was what she'd signed up for. It was what made sense. It was safe. And it made Emma want to scream with frustration at the unfairness of it all. Why did women always have to choose between security and happiness? Why couldn't she have both? The answer, of course, was that life didn't work that way. Especially not for women. Especially not for poor widows with no family and no options. Emma had been practical her whole life. Had done what was expected, made the safe choices, colored within the lines of propriety and duty. And where had it gotten her? Alone, grieving, penniless, traveling across the country to marry a stranger for survival. When she finally fell into fitful sleep sometime after midnight, Emma dreamed of spring flowers blooming in the desert, of Benjamin's hands gentle on her face, of a small ranch house she'd never seen, where wildflowers grew in window boxes, and she woke each morning in arms that held her like she was precious. When she jerked awake at dawn, her face wet with tears, Emma finally knew what she was going to do. It was terrifying. It was reckless. It was quite possibly the worst decision she could make. But it was also the first thing in years that felt entirely, completely right. The following days passed in a blur of preparation and quiet terror, as Emma tried to figure out how to actually execute her decision. She couldn't simply walk up to Benjamin in the fort compound and announce she'd chosen him. That would cause immediate scandal, would get him court-martialed before they could even leave. She couldn't wait until Captain Thornton returned and break off the engagement, because he would demand answers, and those answers would destroy Benjamin's military career and possibly get him shot in a duel. No, Emma realized. If she was going to do this, she needed to be smart about it. She needed to plan. She needed to be as strategic as Benjamin would be planning a military operation. So she began gathering information, carefully and quietly. She chatted with Mrs. Patterson about when exactly the captain was expected back. She asked the sutler's wife innocent questions about stagecoach schedules to Tucson. She counted the small amount of money she had left from selling her possessions back in Missouri, figuring out if it was enough for travel and supplies. And she watched Benjamin from a distance, trying to gauge whether his offer still stood or if he'd reconsidered in the cold light of day. He gave no sign either way. Benjamin went about his duties with the same professional competence he always showed, drilling soldiers, managing supplies, maintaining order. But twice Emma caught him watching her across the parade ground with an expression that made her heart skip. And once, when their paths crossed near the stables, he'd paused just long enough to murmur, 10 days until he returns. If you need to talk, I'll be at the creek Sunday afternoon. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It meant his offer was real, that he was waiting, that he would be there if she chose him. That Sunday, Emma told Mrs. Patterson she had a headache and begged off from the after-services social. Instead, she changed out of her church dress into something simpler and more practical, stuffed a small bag with essential supplies and what little money she had, and walked out to the creek with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Benjamin was there, sitting on the rock where they'd talked before, and when he saw her approaching with the bag, his whole body went still. He stood slowly, hope and disbelief warring on his face. Emma? Her name was a question, a prayer. I choose you, Emma said, and her voice only shook a little. I choose you, Benjamin. I choose the hard life and the scandal and the uncertainty. I choose passion over security. I choose us. Benjamin closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and crushed her against his chest, his arms coming around her like bands of steel. Emma felt him shaking, felt the rapid thunder of his heart against her cheek, and realized this strong, controlled soldier was trembling with emotion. When he finally released her enough to look at her face, his eyes were suspiciously bright. Are you sure? He asked hoarsely. Because once we do this, there's no going back. Thornton returns in 3 days. We'll need to be gone before then. We'll have to leave tonight, right now, while there's still time. And Emma, we won't be able to return. Ever. You understand that? Emma nodded. I understand, and I'm sure. She reached up and cupped his bearded jaw, feeling the scratch of whiskers against her palm. I'm terrified, but I'm sure. I don't want to live a safe, empty life. I want to live a real one. With you. Benjamin's control finally shattered. He lowered his head and kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste kiss Emma had shared with her first husband at their wedding. This was fire and desperation and promise all tangled together. His hands came up to cradle her face, angling her mouth to deepen the kiss, and Emma felt like she was drowning in sensation, in want, in the rightness of being in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Benjamin rested his forehead against hers. I have horses ready, he said quietly. Supplies. Everything we need to make it to Tucson. I've been preparing since our last conversation, hoping. He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Emma understood. He'd been hoping she would choose him, but he'd also been realistic enough to prepare for either outcome. "We need to leave within the hour," Benjamin continued, "before evening muster when they'll notice we're both missing. I've arranged for a friend in Tucson to meet us, someone who owes me a favor and won't ask questions. He'll help us find the land I mentioned. Help us get started. But Emma, I need you to understand what you're giving up. Once we ride out of here, you'll be seen as a fallen woman. The army will label me a deserter and dishonorable. We'll be starting over with nothing but what we can carry and what I've saved. It won't be easy." Emma smiled despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Nothing worth having is easy. My mother used to say that." She picked up the bag she'd dropped when Benjamin had embraced her. "This is everything I own in the world. Everything I brought from Missouri. If I was willing to travel across the country for a stranger, I can certainly ride to Tucson with a man I—" She paused, the word love hovering on her tongue. Too big and too new to say out loud yet. But Benjamin heard it anyway, saw it in her eyes, and something fierce and tender filled his expression. "With a man you're willing to build a life with," he finished for her gently. "That's enough for now. The rest will come." He caught her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a vow. "Let me get the horses. Wait here. If anyone sees us leaving together, they'll try to stop us. We need to be smart about this." 20 minutes later, Emma found herself mounted on a sturdy mare. Benjamin beside her on a larger gelding, the fort at their backs, and the vast Arizona landscape spread before them in the golden light of late afternoon. Benjamin had changed into civilian clothes and packed his uniform away, shedding his military identity like a snake shedding skin. Emma had left a letter in her cabin, addressed to Mrs. Patterson, apologizing for any scandal her departure would cause, and asking her to tell Captain Thornton that Emma had realized she couldn't marry him, that she was sorry for any inconvenience or embarrassment, and that she hoped he would understand. It wasn't much, but it was all the explanation she could offer. As they rode away from Fort McDowell, following the creek south toward the distant mountains, Emma refused to look back. Looking back meant second-guessing. Looking back meant fear. So instead, she looked at Benjamin riding beside her, tall and confident in the saddle. And she looked at the desert landscape bursting with spring blooms. And she looked forward to whatever future they would build together. They rode in silence for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and the fort, both of them tense and listening for sounds of pursuit. But none came. Apparently, their absence hadn't been noticed yet. Or if it had, no one had connected the dots that Emma and Benjamin had left together. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Benjamin finally slowed his horse and glanced at Emma. "There's a place about another hour's ride from here. A small canyon with water and shelter. We'll camp there tonight and rest the horses. Then we'll ride through tomorrow and reach Tucson by evening." Emma nodded, trying not to show how sore she already was. She'd ridden as a girl on her family's farm, but it had been years, and hours in the saddle after such a long break was making muscles she'd forgotten existed scream in protest. Benjamin, with that uncanny awareness he seemed to have of her, noticed anyway. "We'll take it slow," he said gently. "I should have thought about you not being accustomed to long rides. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Emma said firmly. "I'm tougher than I look. I'll manage. She straightened in the saddle, ignoring the ache in her back and thighs. Besides, I chose this. All of it, including the sore muscles. Benjamin's smile, rare and beautiful, broke across his face like sunrise. You did, and I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for that choice. They rode on as the desert twilight deepened around them, and despite the physical discomfort, despite the uncertainty of their future, despite having just thrown away security and respectability for love and risk, Emma felt something settle, in her chest. Peace. Rightness. The bone-deep certainty that she'd finally made a choice that was truly hers. Not dictated by duty or necessity or other people's expectations, but her own. She'd chosen Benjamin. She'd chosen herself. She'd chosen to believe that happiness was worth fighting for, worth the risks and the costs. And whatever came next, whatever hardships they would face building a life together, Emma knew she would never regret this moment. This ride through the Arizona desert, with spring blooming all around them, and the man she was falling in love with at her side. The canyon Benjamin led them to was exactly as he'd described. A small protected space with rock walls that blocked the wind, a spring-fed pool of clear water, and enough grass for the horses. Benjamin helped Emma dismount, his hands spanning her waist, and when her legs nearly buckled from the hours in the saddle, he steadied her with quiet strength. Sit, he ordered gently, guiding her to a flat rock. Let me set up camp and tend the horses. You rest. Emma wanted to protest, wanted to help, wanted to prove she could pull her weight, but her body had other ideas, and she found herself sinking gratefully onto the rock, while Benjamin moved with efficient competence, unsaddling the horses, hobbling them where they could graze and drink, building a small fire as the last light faded from the sky. When he had coffee brewing and beans heating in a pan, he crouched in front of Emma and began gently removing her boots. "What are you doing?" Emma asked, startled by the intimacy of the gesture. "Taking care of you," Benjamin said simply. "You've been in these boots all day. Your feet need to breathe." He set her boots aside and, before Emma could stop him, began massaging her aching feet through her stockings with firm, knowing pressure. Emma gasped at the sensation, part pleasure and part pain as blood flow returned to cramped muscles. "Benjamin, you don't have to." But he cut her off with a look. "I know I don't have to. I want to. Get used to it, Emma. We're partners now. That means taking care of each other." He continued his ministrations, working his way up to her calves, easing the knots from muscles screaming from unaccustomed riding. And Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the tenderness of it. No one had taken care of her like this since she was a child. Her first husband had been kind but distant, expecting her to manage herself while he focused on his business. Coming to Arizona as a mail-order bride, she'd expected more of the same. Polite distance, self-reliance, the loneliness of being married but alone. But here was Benjamin, this soldier who'd seen and done terrible things, who had every reason to be hard and closed off, tending her sore feet with gentle hands and making sure she was comfortable before he even thought about his own needs. When he finally released her feet and went to check on their simple meal, Emma watched him move around the small camp with an efficiency that spoke of years living rough. He poured coffee into tin cups, dished beans onto metal plates, and brought her portion to her before serving himself. They ate in comfortable silence, the firelight dancing between them, coyotes yipping in the distance, and the desert night settling around them like a blanket. After they'd finished eating, and Benjamin had cleaned their dishes in the spring water, He came and sat beside Emma on the rock, close but not touching, both of them staring into the fire. "Tell me about yourself," he said quietly. "Your life before Arizona, your family. I realized I've been so focused on wanting you that I never asked about who you really are." Emma appreciated the question, the genuine desire to know her beyond the attraction between them. So she told him about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, the oldest of 6 children, learning to work hard because survival demanded it. About her mother, who'd taught her to find beauty even in difficult circumstances, who'd kept a flower garden no matter how hard the years got. About her father, who'd been stern but fair, who'd insisted all his children learn to read and write because education was the one thing no one could take from you. She told him about marrying at 21 to a merchant's son her father approved of, about the comfortable but passionless years of that marriage, about her husband's sudden death from pneumonia that had left her not just widowed, but destitute when she discovered the debts he'd hidden, about selling everything she owned to pay creditors and having nothing left, about her siblings unable or unwilling to help support a widowed sister, about the desperate loneliness of being 27 and starting over with nothing. "I saw Captain Thornton's advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper," Emma said quietly. "Army captain seeking respectable wife for companionship and household management. It seemed like providence, an answer to prayer, a way to survive." She looked at Benjamin, his face golden in the firelight. "I told myself I was lucky, that security mattered more than affection, that I should be grateful any man wanted to marry me at my age, with my lack of prospects." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But then I met you, and I realized I'd been preparing to settle, to accept less than I deserved, because I thought it was all that was available to me. You showed me different." Benjamin reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. His palm was calloused from years of military service, warm and strong and solid. "You deserve everything, Emma. Every good thing this world has to offer. And I know I can't give you luxury or ease, but I swear I will spend every day trying to give you happiness." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Now it's your turn. Ask me anything you want to know." So Emma asked, and Benjamin answered, his voice low and honest in the darkness. He told her about growing up poor in Ohio, about enlisting at 17 to escape a father who drank and a future with no prospects, about the Indian Wars and the things he'd seen and done that still haunted his dreams, about the lives he'd taken and the friends he'd lost, and the slow erosion of his soul that came from years of violence. "I stopped feeling much of anything about 5 years ago," he admitted. "Just went through the motions, did my duty, survived. I decided to leave the army, to find some remote place where I could live alone and maybe find some peace before I died. I wasn't looking for love or connection. I'd given up on that possibility." He turned to look at her, and the raw emotion in his face made Emma's breath catch. "Then you stepped off that stagecoach, tired and dusty and travel-worn, but standing so straight, so strong. You looked around at this harsh place you'd come to, at the rough fort and the rougher soldiers, and you didn't flinch. You just lifted your chin higher and walked forward like you owned the world." Benjamin's thumb traced patterns on the back of her hand. I felt something crack open in my chest, something I thought was dead. And every day after that, every glimpse of you, every word you spoke, every time I watched you adapt and survive and find beauty in this difficult place, that crack got wider until I couldn't ignore it anymore. You brought me back to life, Emma. Made me want things again. Made me believe I could be something other than a killer. That I could build instead of destroy. That I could love instead of just endure. Emma felt tears slide down her cheeks at his words, at the vulnerability and honesty he was offering her. She shifted closer to him on the rock until their shoulders touched, until she could rest her head against his arm. And Benjamin's free hand came up to stroke her hair with achingly gentle touches. They sat like that for a long time, the fire burning low, stars emerging overhead in brilliant profusion, the desert night wrapping around them. When Emma finally lifted her head, Benjamin used his thumb to wipe away the tears on her cheeks, then cupped her face and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. This kiss was different from their desperate one by the creek. This was a promise, a beginning, the first page of a story they were writing together. When they separated, Benjamin's eyes searched her face in the dying firelight. We should sleep. Tomorrow is a long ride. He stood and offered his hand to help her up, then led her to where he'd spread bedrolls near the fire. Emma's heart began to pound as she realized there were 2 bedrolls, separated by a careful distance. Propriety maintained even here in the wilderness, with no witnesses but stars and coyotes. Benjamin saw her looking and gave her a small, sad smile. I won't dishonor you, Emma. Not until we're properly married. I know that seems like a strange concern given that we just ran away together and destroyed both our reputations. But it matters to me that I treat you right, that I'm worthy of the trust you're placing in me. Emma felt a rush of love so powerful it nearly knocked her over. This man, this dangerous soldier who'd fought and killed and seen the worst humanity had to offer, was being careful with her virtue, was protecting her honor even when no one else would know or care. Thank you, she whispered, for respecting me, for... She gestured helplessly at the separate bedrolls, at his restraint, at all of it. Benjamin kissed her forehead gently. Always. Now try to sleep. I'll keep watch for a while. He wrapped her in blankets, made sure she was comfortable, then settled himself a few feet away with his back against a rock and his rifle across his knees, keeping watch over her and the camp as the desert night deepened around them. Emma lay there, warm in her bedroll, watching Benjamin's profile silhouetted against the stars, and felt something settle deep in her bones. Safety. Trust. The knowledge that she'd chosen well, that this man who'd offered her a hard life on a remote ranch was also offering her something precious, genuine partnership, real respect, and love that went deeper than convenience or transaction. She'd traveled all the way to Arizona, thinking she was coming to marry Captain Thornton, but fate, or providence, or simple chance had given her Benjamin Carter instead. And as Emma drifted off to sleep to the sound of coyotes calling in the distance and the quiet crackle of the dying fire, she sent up a prayer of gratitude that she'd been brave enough to choose him, to choose herself, to choose the uncertain promise of happiness over the certain emptiness of security. Emma woke just before dawn to find Benjamin crouched beside her bedroll, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Time to ride," he said softly. "I want to put more distance between us and the fort before full light." She sat up, her body protesting every movement after yesterday's long ride and the hard ground, but she forced herself to stand and began rolling up her bedding. Benjamin had already packed his gear and saddled the horses, and he'd left coffee warming by the rebuilt fire, along with hardtack and jerky, for a quick breakfast. They ate standing up, both of them tense and listening for sounds of pursuit that still didn't come. As the sky lightened from black to gray to pale gold, they mounted up and continued south, following game trails and dry washes that Benjamin seemed to know instinctively. Emma realized he must have scouted this route before, planning their escape even before she'd agreed to it, and the thought of his careful preparation made her feel both protected and slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was risking for her. The day passed in a blur of riding. They stopped twice to rest the horses and stretch their aching muscles, but Benjamin kept them moving at a steady pace, always watching their back trail, always alert. Emma focused on staying in the saddle and not complaining about the discomfort, determined to prove she could handle whatever this new life demanded. The landscape changed as they traveled. The high desert giving way to lower elevations with more vegetation, more color. Palo Verde trees stood like green sentinels, their bark bright against the rust-colored earth. Ocotillo waved spiny arms crowned with red blooms. Barrel cactus squatted beside the trail like fat green barrels indeed. And everywhere, those spring wildflowers Benjamin had shown her, painting the desert in purple and gold and orange, proving that even the harshest places could nurture beauty if you knew where to look. As the afternoon wore on and the sun beat down mercilessly, Emma began to flag. The heat, the hours in the saddle, the emotional exhaustion of the past days, all of it caught up with her at once. Benjamin noticed immediately, as he seemed to notice everything about her. He called a halt in the shade of a massive saguaro and helped her dismount, steadying her when her legs buckled. "You're doing so well," he said, making her sit in the shade while he brought her water from his canteen. "Better than some soldiers I've seen on their first long march." Emma drank gratefully, the water sun-warmed but wonderful. "How much farther to Tucson?" Benjamin checked the position of the sun. 3 more hours, maybe 4. We'll make it well before dark." He crouched in front of her, his steel-gray eyes searching her face with concern. "Can you manage? We can rest longer if you need to." Emma shook her head. "I can manage. The sooner we get there, the sooner we're truly safe from pursuit." She reached out and touched his bearded jaw, still marveling that she was allowed to touch him like this, that he was hers now. "I won't slow you down, Benjamin. I promise." His hand covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his face. "You could never slow me down. You're the strongest woman I've ever met." He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, and the intimacy of the gesture, the tenderness in his eyes, made Emma's heart squeeze. This was real. This thing between them was real. Not just attraction or desperation, but something deeper, something worth the risks they were taking. They rode on as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, and just as shadows were lengthening across the desert, buildings appeared in the distance. Tucson. The town was larger than Emma had expected, a sprawling mix of adobe and wood structures that had grown up around the old Spanish presidio. As they rode down the main street in the golden light of early evening, Emma was acutely aware of how they must look, dusty and travel-worn, obviously having ridden hard. A man and woman arriving together without chaperone or propriety. But if anyone noticed or cared, they kept it to themselves. This was the frontier, where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions. Benjamin led them to a modest boarding house on the edge of town, and the woman who answered his knock, a sturdy Mexican woman in her 50s, greeted him with obvious familiarity. "Teniente Carter," she said warmly, then noticed Emma and her expression shifted to knowing approval. "Ah. So this is why you wrote asking for 2 rooms." She smiled at Emma. "I am Senora Martinez. Welcome to my home." Benjamin handled the arrangements in Spanish, which surprised Emma until she remembered he'd spent years in this territory, would naturally have learned the language. Senora Martinez showed them to 2 small but clean rooms on the 2nd floor, side by side, with a shared balcony overlooking a courtyard garden. "I will bring food," the older woman said. "You both look like you need rest and good meal." When she'd gone, Emma stood on the balcony breathing in the scent of jasmine and roses from the garden below, and felt the tension that had been coiled tight in her chest for days finally begin to ease. They'd made it. They were here. They were safe. Benjamin came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "My friend Miguel will meet us here tomorrow morning. He's the one I told you about, the one who's going to help us find land. He owns a ranch about 20 miles south of here, near the Santa Cruz River. Good man. I saved his life once during a raid. He's offered to help us get started, no questions asked." Emma turned to look at him. "You really have thought of everything, haven't you?" Benjamin's smile was tired but genuine. "I've been planning this for months, even before I met you. I just never thought I'd have a reason beyond my own need to escape. You gave me a better reason, a reason to build something, instead of just running away from what I was running from." He reached out and tucked a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. "You gave me hope, Emma, the kind I thought I'd lost forever." Before Emma could respond, Senora Martinez returned with a tray laden with food: thick tortillas, spicy beans, shredded beef, fresh tomatoes and peppers, and sweet agua fresca. She set it on a small table on the balcony and gave them both a maternal look. "Eat. Rest. Tomorrow is time enough for whatever troubles you are running from." She left before either of them could respond, and Emma realized the older woman understood exactly what they were: runaways, fugitives from propriety, if not from actual law. They ate ravenously, both of them having subsisted on hardtack and jerky all day, and the home-cooked meal felt like the greatest luxury Emma had ever experienced. As the sky darkened and stars emerged, they sat together on the balcony in comfortable silence, the sounds of the town settling for the night, drifting up from the streets below. Finally, Benjamin stood and offered his hand to help Emma to her feet. "You need sleep, real sleep in a real bed." He walked her to her room door, and for a moment they stood there in the hallway, neither quite ready to separate, even though exhaustion pulled at both of them. "Thank you," Emma said softly. "For everything. For offering me this choice. For being patient with my inexperience. For taking care of me." Benjamin cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones in that gesture she was learning to love. "You don't need to thank me for treating you the way you deserve to be treated. That's just what loving someone means." He kissed her, soft and sweet. A goodnight kiss that held promise of all the nights to come. "Sleep well, Emma. Tomorrow we start building our future." Emma did sleep well, better than she had in weeks, in a real bed with clean sheets, and the knowledge that she'd made the right choice. When she woke to morning sun streaming through the window, she felt renewed, ready to face whatever came next. Benjamin was already awake, she discovered, waiting for her in the courtyard garden with coffee and sweet bread from a local panaderia. He'd shaved and cleaned up, and seeing him in the morning light, his sandy brown hair damp from washing, his steel-gray eyes warm as they found her face, Emma felt her heart skip in that by now familiar way. How had she gotten so lucky? How had running away to marry a stranger led her to this man instead? They were lingering over their coffee when a tall Mexican man in his 40s, weathered and strong, strode into the courtyard and greeted Benjamin with a warm abrazo. "Amigo," he said, pounding Benjamin's back. "It has been too long." He turned to Emma and removed his hat with courtly grace. "And you must be the lady who has finally convinced my friend that life is worth living. I am Miguel Vasquez." Emma liked him immediately. There was warmth in Miguel's dark eyes and genuine happiness for Benjamin that made her feel welcomed rather than judged. Over more coffee, the three of them discussed plans. Miguel knew of several parcels of land for sale south of Tucson, near his own ranch. One in particular sounded promising: a small valley with a year-round creek, good grazing land, and a half-built cabin that the previous owner had abandoned when his wife died. "It needs work," Miguel admitted. "Much work. But the bones are good. The water is reliable, and it is remote enough that no one will bother you, but close enough to my ranch that you will have neighbors if you need help." Benjamin looked at Emma. "What do you think? Should we ride out and look at it?" Emma nodded. "Yes, let's see it." Within the hour, they were mounted on fresh horses borrowed from Miguel and riding south out of Tucson. The landscape here was different from the high desert around Fort McDowell. Greener with the promise of the nearby river, more lush. As they rode, Miguel told stories about the territory, about settling here after the Mexican War, about building his ranch from nothing. Emma listened and learned, filing away information about crops and water rights, and dealing with Apache bands that still roamed the territory. The valley Miguel led them to took Emma's breath away. It was everything he'd promised and more. A green bowl nestled between low hills, with a creek running clear through the center, cottonwoods providing shade, and grass growing thick enough to support cattle or horses. The cabin sat on a rise overlooking the creek, half finished but solidly built from adobe and timber, with good bones, as Miguel had said. Emma dismounted and walked through the structure, her mind already furnishing it, seeing what it could become. 2 rooms currently, but space to add more. A large main room with a fireplace already built. A smaller room that could be a bedroom. No windows yet, but the openings were there, waiting for glass or shutters. The roof was partially complete, needing repair but not replacement. As she stood in what would be their home, imagining curtains in the windows, and a table they'd build together, and a bed where they'd sleep in each other's arms, Benjamin came to stand behind her. His hands rested gently on her shoulders, and she could feel the tension in him, waiting for her verdict. "It's perfect," Emma said, turning to face him. "It needs work, yes, but it's perfect. We can build something here, something that's ours." Benjamin's smile was like sunrise, hope and relief and joy all mixed together. "You're sure? It's rough, Emma. Rougher than anything you're used to. No neighbors for miles except Miguel. Hard work from dawn to dusk just to survive. Emma reached up and framed his face with her hands, making sure he was looking directly at her. I chose a hard life with you over an easy life without you. I meant it. This valley, this half-built cabin, this chance to create something from nothing, it's more than I ever hoped for. She kissed him, there in the doorway of their unfinished home, with Miguel discreetly examining the creek water in the distance and the Arizona sun warming their faces. Let's buy it. Let's make it ours. So they did. Benjamin had saved carefully during his years in the army, and combined with Emma's small remaining funds, they had just enough to purchase the land and buy basic supplies to get started. Miguel helped them negotiate with the land office, vouched for them as upstanding citizens, and by week's end, the valley and its unfinished cabin belonged to Emma and Benjamin Carter. They'd married quietly the day before the land purchase, in Senora Martinez's parlor with Miguel and the Senora's witnesses. No white dress or church ceremony. No family or friends. Just Emma in her best traveling dress, and Benjamin in simple dark trousers and white shirt. And a justice of the peace who asked no questions about where they'd come from or why they seemed in such a hurry. When Benjamin slipped a simple gold band on Emma's finger and promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life, his voice had been steady and sure. When Emma had made the same promise in return, she'd meant every word with an intensity that bordered on prayer. They were married, legally, binding, forever. Emma Carter now, no longer Emma Whitfield. A new name for a new life. That night, their wedding night, Benjamin carried Emma over the threshold of their room at the boarding house, and finally, they came together without restraint or propriety holding them apart. Benjamin was achingly gentle, patient with Emma's nervousness, making sure she felt cherished and desired in equal measure. And when they lay tangled together afterward, Emma's head on Benjamin's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow, she felt something in her soul slot into place like a key in a lock. This was what she'd been missing. This partnership, this passion, this feeling of being seen and valued and loved for exactly who she was. The weeks that followed were the hardest physical work Emma had ever done in her life, and also the happiest. They moved out to the valley and lived in a tent while they worked on the cabin from dawn to dusk. Benjamin cut and hauled timber for roof repairs and window frames. Emma mixed adobe and helped patch walls, her hands raw and blistered from the work. They built furniture together, a table, chairs, a bed frame that Benjamin constructed with such care it was almost beautiful. Miguel came by weekly with supplies and advice, teaching them what they needed to know about ranching in this territory. His wife, Rosa, became Emma's first friend, showing her which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to preserve food for the hot summers, how to make soap and candles and all the things a ranch wife needed to know. Slowly, the cabin took shape. Windows got installed, the roof got finished, a door got hung. Emma sewed curtains from fabric bought in Tucson. Benjamin built shelves and cabinets. They planted a garden, buying seeds from the mercantile and hoping they'd chosen the right crops for this climate. And every night, they collapsed into their bed exhausted and filthy and completely content. And Benjamin would pull Emma into his arms, and they would talk about their day, about their plans, about the life they were building together. 2 months after they'd arrived in the valley, Emma woke one morning to realize her monthly courses were late. Very late. She lay in bed watching early light filter through the curtains she'd made, Her hand pressed to her still flat belly and felt a mixture of joy and terror flood through her. A baby. She was almost certainly carrying Benjamin's child. She should tell him immediately, but fear made her hesitate. They were still struggling to establish themselves, still working dawn to dusk just to have food and shelter. A baby would make everything harder. More mouths to feed, more work, more responsibility. What if Benjamin wasn't ready? What if this wasn't what he wanted so soon? But when she finally worked up the courage to tell him that evening, as they sat on their small porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Benjamin's reaction drove away all her fears. He went utterly still for a moment, his steel-gray eyes searching her face. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly Emma could barely breathe, and when he pulled back, there were tears on his weathered cheeks. "A baby," he whispered, his hand coming to rest on her belly with wonder. "We're going to have a baby." His joy was uncomplicated and absolute, and it made Emma's eyes burn with tears of her own. "You're happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy?" Benjamin laughed, the sound rough with emotion. "Emma, I spent years believing I'd die alone, that I didn't deserve family or home or happiness. You've given me all three. And now a child?" He kissed her with aching tenderness. "I'm beyond happy. I'm blessed." He spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about finishing another room on the cabin before winter, about buying livestock so they'd have milk and meat, about building a cradle. His excitement was infectious, and Emma found herself caught up in it, her own fears dissolving in the face of his confidence that they could handle whatever came. That night, lying in their bed with Benjamin's hand protective on her belly and the desert night quiet around them, Emma sent up a prayer of gratitude that she'd been brave enough to choose this. Choose him. Choose a life that was hard but honest, poor but rich in love. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the hot Arizona summer. Emma continued working as long as she could, stubbornly refusing to be treated like an invalid, despite Benjamin's worried hovering. Together they expanded the cabin, adding a second bedroom for the baby and improving their living space. Miguel helped Benjamin purchase a small herd of cattle and some chickens, teaching him how to manage the animals and the land. Rosa brought baby clothes she'd saved from her own children and sat with Emma, teaching her to knit and sew tiny garments. The valley they'd claimed began to feel like home. Emma's garden flourished with careful tending, providing vegetables that she learned to preserve for winter. The cattle grazed contentedly by the creek. The chickens produced eggs. And slowly, day by day, the life Emma and Benjamin were building together took root and grew like those spring wildflowers in the desert, beautiful and resilient and improbably perfect. They heard news occasionally from Tucson about Fort McDowell. Captain Thornton had returned from patrol, they learned, and had been furious about Emma's departure. He'd threatened to hunt down Benjamin and call him out for betrayal and dishonor. But Miguel, with his connections throughout the territory, had quietly made it known that Benjamin Carter had left the army properly before taking up with Emma, that there had been no desertion or dereliction of duty, and that Captain Thornton's mail-order bride had simply changed her mind before any legal marriage had taken place. It was a generous lie, one that protected Benjamin's reputation and gave them both some measure of safety from pursuit. Eventually, they heard Thornton had let the matter drop and had sent for a different mail-order bride who arrived and married him without incident. The scandal had died down, replaced by newer gossip, and Emma and Benjamin were left in peace to build their life. As summer gave way to fall and Emma's belly swelled with their growing child. She found herself thinking less and less about the life she'd left behind. Missouri seemed like something from another lifetime. Her respectable but empty first marriage, the desperation after her husband's death, even her brief time at Fort McDowell, all of it felt distant and unreal. This was her real life. This valley, this cabin they'd built with their own hands, this man who loved her with such fierce devotion, this baby growing inside her that was the physical proof of that love. She was Emma Carter, wife and soon-to-be mother, and she'd never been happier despite the hard work and constant challenges of frontier life. The baby came in late November, as fall rain softened the desert and brought the scent of wet earth and sage. Rosa and Miguel were there, since the nearest doctor was in Tucson and too far to reach in time. Benjamin paced outside the cabin, unable to stand being inside listening to Emma's pain, but unwilling to leave the property. When Rosa finally emerged hours later and told him he had a daughter, a healthy baby girl with a strong set of lungs, Benjamin burst into the cabin and went straight to the bed, where Emma lay exhausted but radiant, their tiny daughter wrapped in a blanket and held against her chest. He knelt beside the bed, this strong soldier who'd faced death and violence without flinching, and wept openly at the sight of his wife and child. Emma reached out with her free hand and pulled him close, the three of them forming a small, complete circle. "She's perfect," Benjamin whispered, his finger tracing their daughter's tiny face with wonder. "You're both perfect." They named her Sarah, after Emma's mother, and she became the center of their world in ways that completed rather than disrupted their partnership. The years that followed were full and rich despite the constant challenges of ranch life. They expanded their cabin again, adding a proper kitchen and a room for future children. Because Sarah was followed 2 years later by a son they named Thomas, and 2 years after that, by another daughter, Grace. Their ranch prospered modestly as Benjamin's skill with horses became known throughout the territory. People came from as far as Tucson to buy horses he trained, and the income allowed them to improve their land and their home. Emma's garden expanded into a small orchard, apple and peach trees that she nurtured with the same care she gave her children. She learned to make butter and cheese from the cow Benjamin bought her. She preserved fruit and vegetables, pickled and canned and dried, filling their small pantry with food to see them through the harsh seasons. She sewed clothes for her growing family, mended what could be mended, made do with what they had, and never once missed the comfortable security she might have had as Captain Thornton's wife. Because comfort without love, she learned, was just another kind of poverty, and love with hardship was a richness that filled every corner of her life with meaning and joy. Miguel and Rosa became like family, their children playing with Emma and Benjamin's children, their ranches supporting each other through droughts and hard winters, and the occasional Apache raid that still happened in remote areas. Other settlers moved into the region, and slowly a small community formed, people helping people survive in this beautiful but unforgiving land. Emma became known as someone you could go to for help, her skills with healing herbs and her practical kindness making her a valued member of their scattered community. Benjamin, despite his past and his initial desire to hide away from the world, found himself drawn into community leadership. His military experience and calm competence in crises made him someone people naturally turned to when problems arose. He helped organize a volunteer militia when Apache raids threatened. He mediated disputes over water rights and land boundaries. He taught younger men how to survive in this territory that could kill the unprepared. And slowly, the demons that had haunted him when Emma first met him began to fade. replaced by purpose and connection, and the daily proof that he was building rather than destroying, creating rather than killing. On their 5th anniversary, Benjamin surprised Emma by taking her to Tucson for a night, leaving the children with Miguel and Rosa. It was the first time they'd been alone together, truly alone, since Thomas had been born, and Emma felt like a young bride again as they checked into the same boarding house where they'd stayed 5 years before. Senora Martinez, older now but still running her establishment with capable hands, greeted them like long-lost family and gave them her best room. That evening, walking through Tucson's plaza with Benjamin's arm around her waist, Emma found herself thinking about the scared young widow who'd arrived here 5 years ago, running away from a promise she couldn't keep, toward a man and a future she couldn't have imagined. She thought about the choice she'd made, the risks she'd taken, the security she'd given up, and she felt nothing but gratitude that she'd been brave enough, desperate enough, or foolish enough, she still wasn't sure which, to choose passion over practicality, love over safety, Benjamin over duty. Benjamin must have sensed her thoughts, because he pulled her closer and pressed a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Emma smiled up at him. This man who defended her honor in a blizzard 5 years ago, who'd offered her an impossible choice and made good on every promise. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am, how different my life might have been if I'd made the safe choice instead of the right one." Benjamin stopped walking and turned her to face him there in the plaza, with the evening crowd flowing around them. "I'm the lucky one, Emma. You saved me. You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive. You gave me home and family and purpose. Everything good in my life came from the moment you chose me." He kissed her, right there in public, deep and long and full of the passion that hadn't dimmed one bit despite 5 years of marriage and hard work and the chaos of raising children. When they finally separated, both breathing harder, Emma saw their reflection in a shop window, a sun-weathered rancher and his wife, not young anymore, but not old either, worn from hard living, but glowing with health and happiness. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked quietly, the question she'd never quite dared ask before. "Giving up your military career? The scandal? Everything you sacrificed for me?" Benjamin cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones in that gesture that still made her heart skip. "Not for one single second. Not ever. You were the best choice I ever made, Emma Carter. The only choice that mattered." And looking into his steel gray eyes, seeing the absolute truth there, Emma believed him. They returned to their ranch the next day to the joyful chaos of their children and the constant demands of frontier life. But something had settled even more deeply in Emma's heart during those hours alone with Benjamin. The absolute certainty that she'd chosen well, that the life they'd built together, hard as it sometimes was exactly the life she was meant to live. That love and partnership and shared purpose were worth more than any amount of security or social standing. That she was exactly where she belonged. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and harvests and children growing. Sarah became a solemn little girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination. Thomas grew into a boy who loved horses as much as Benjamin did, following his father everywhere and absorbing everything he taught. Grace remained the baby, sunny and charming, wrapping everyone around her tiny finger. The ranch continued to prosper modestly. They never became wealthy, but they were comfortable, which was more than Emma had dared hope, for that day she'd ridden away from Fort McDowell toward an uncertain future. The political situation in Arizona Territory changed. Statehood always just around the corner, but never quite arriving. Apache resistance finally ended with Geronimo's surrender, bringing a fragile peace to the region. More settlers arrived. Towns grew. The frontier became slightly less wild, though never truly tame. Emma and Benjamin watched these changes from their small valley, raising their children, working their land, loving each other through good seasons and hard ones. Occasionally, very occasionally, Emma thought about Captain Richard Thornton and wondered what her life might have been like if she'd made the practical choice. If she'd stayed at Fort McDowell, married him as planned, lived as a military wife with security and social standing. She tried to imagine herself in that life and simply couldn't. That version of Emma, the one who would have chosen safety over passion, seemed like a different person entirely. A ghost of who she might have been if fear had won out over courage. When Sarah was 7 and old enough to understand, Emma told her the story of how she and Benjamin had met. She softened some of the details, made it sound more romantic and less desperate than it had actually been. But she kept the essential truth intact. "I was supposed to marry someone else," Emma explained as they worked together in the garden, pulling weeds and checking on vegetables. "A very respectable man who would have given me a comfortable life. But then I met your father." Sarah looked up at her mother with those serious gray eyes. "And you loved him instead?" Emma smiled, remembering Benjamin defending her in the blizzard. The fierce protectiveness in his face, the way her heart had known before her head that this was the man she was meant to be with. "Yes," she said simply. "I loved him instead. And even though choosing him meant giving up security and respectability, even though it meant hard work and struggle, I never regretted it. Because love matters more than comfort, sweetheart. Purpose matters more than ease, and building a life with someone who truly sees you and values you is worth any sacrifice." Sarah considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "Were you scared when you left everything to be with Papa?" Emma thought about that terrifying ride away from Fort McDowell, not knowing what waited ahead, only knowing she couldn't marry a man she didn't love when Benjamin existed in the world. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But I was also more alive than I'd ever been. Sometimes the right choice is also the scary choice. That doesn't mean it's not right." Sarah nodded, filing this information away with the careful attention she gave everything. "I hope when I grow up, I'm as brave as you were, Mama." Emma pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of sunshine and earth that clung to her. "You will be. You're already braver than you know." That conversation stayed with Emma for days afterward, making her reflect on the path her life had taken. She'd been 27 when she'd arrived in Arizona Territory, young enough still to start over, but old enough to feel like her options were running out. She'd felt desperate then, trapped by circumstance and poverty, willing to marry a stranger simply to survive. But somehow, that desperation had led her to the greatest gift of her life. Had led her to Benjamin, to this ranch, to these children, to a purpose and partnership she'd never known existed. Was it luck? Providence? Simple chance? Emma didn't know, and ultimately, it didn't matter. What mattered was that when the moment came, when Benjamin had offered her that impossible choice by the creek, she'd been brave enough to take it. She'd been brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of happiness. And that bravery had been rewarded 1,000 times over in the years since. As Emma watched Benjamin work with Thomas in the corral, teaching their son the patience and skill required to train horses. She felt that familiar swell of love and gratitude that never quite faded. This was her life. This man, these children, this land they'd claimed and tamed, this hard, beautiful, imperfectly perfect life they'd built from nothing but love and determination and stubborn hope. Years later, when they were older and their children were grown and starting families of their own, Emma and Benjamin would sit on the porch of their expanded cabin and watch sunsets over the valley they'd made their own. Sarah had married a neighboring rancher's son and lived close enough to visit often with Emma's grandchildren. Thomas had taken over much of the ranch work, partnering with Benjamin in a way that made Emma's heart full. Grace had surprised them all by becoming a teacher, riding to Tucson 3 times a week to teach at the school there. Their life had been hard, yes, filled with struggles and setbacks, and the constant challenge of wringing a living from unforgiving land. But it had also been rich in ways that comfort and security could never provide. Rich in love, in purpose, in the satisfaction of building something lasting with your own hands and heart. One evening, as they sat together watching the sky burn gold and crimson, Benjamin took Emma's hand in his. Both their hands were weathered now, marked by decades of hard work. But the gesture was the same as it had been that first night by the campfire, when they'd fled into the unknown together. "Do you remember?" Benjamin said quietly. "That day by the creek when I told you that you had a choice?" Emma smiled, remembering the fear and the hope that had warred in her chest, the terrifying leap of faith she'd taken. I remember thinking you were offering me an impossible dream." Benjamin brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, the gesture achingly tender even after all these years. "And was it impossible?" Emma looked out over the valley they'd claimed, at the home they'd built, at the life they'd created through sheer determination and love. She thought about their children and grandchildren, about the community they'd helped build, about the decades of partnership and passion and purpose they'd shared. "No," she said finally. "It wasn't impossible. It was just hard, but the best things always are." She leaned into Benjamin's side, and his arm came around her shoulders, holding her close the way he'd done 1,000 times before. They sat in comfortable silence as the desert cooled and stars began to emerge overhead. 2 people who'd chosen each other when it was impractical and risky and foolish. 2 people who'd built something beautiful from that impossible choice. 2 people who'd proven that sometimes the heart knows better than the head, and that love, real love, was worth any sacrifice. As the last light faded from the sky and the first coyotes began their evening songs, Emma thought about the young widow who'd arrived in Arizona territory all those years ago, desperate and scared and willing to settle for security without affection. She thought about the mail-order bride who'd never made it to her wedding, and she thought about the woman she'd become instead, rancher's wife, mother, community member, partner, in every sense of the word. She'd chosen passion over practicality that day by the creek. She'd chosen Benjamin when every rule said she shouldn't. She'd chosen herself, her own happiness, over duty and obligation and fear. And that choice, that single moment of courage, had given her a life beyond anything she'd dared imagine. A life full of love and purpose and deep, abiding contentment. A life where every morning she woke in the arms of a man who cherished her, who saw her, who chose her back every single day. A life that was hard, yes, but also beautiful in ways that easy could never be. Emma smiled into the darkness, her head on Benjamin's shoulder, and sent up a prayer of gratitude that she'd been brave enough to take that leap of faith, that she'd been strong enough to choose differently, that she'd been blessed enough to find Benjamin Carter in the first place. The desert night settled around them, warm and full of familiar sounds, and Emma Carter, former widow, former mail-order bride, now rancher's wife and matriarch of a family she'd built through love and sacrifice, felt nothing but peace. She'd made her choice all those years ago, and she'd spent every day since proving it was the right one. And that, Emma thought as sleep pulled at her, and Benjamin's steady heartbeat thrummed beneath her ear, was the greatest gift of all. Not security, not comfort, but the absolute certainty that you'd chosen well, that you'd taken the risk when it mattered, that you'd been brave enough to grasp happiness with both hands when it appeared, even if it meant giving up everything else. Because in the end, everything else didn't matter. Only this. Only love. Only the life you built with someone who saw you, truly saw you, and loved every part of what they found. The years continued their steady march, as years always do, and Emma and Benjamin grew older together with the grace that comes from a life well lived. Their bodies showed the marks of frontier existence. Benjamin's hands gnarled from decades of ranch work, Emma's face lined by the Arizona sun, both of them moving a bit slower, a bit more carefully than they once had. But their love, if anything, had deepened. The passion of youth had mellowed into something even richer, a bone-deep companionship and understanding that came from facing every challenge life threw at them side by side. They knew each other completely now. Every scar and story, every fear and dream, every quirk and habit. They could communicate with a glance across a room, could sense when the other needed comfort or space. Had developed a partnership so complete that sometimes Emma couldn't remember where she ended, and Benjamin began. Their grandchildren grew, some staying in the territory, some venturing to other places as the West opened up and opportunities expanded. Sarah's oldest son showed the same talent with horses that Benjamin had, and spent his summers at the ranch learning from his grandfather. Thomas's daughters were fearless riders who could rope cattle as well as any man. Grace's children were being educated in ways Emma could never have imagined when she'd first arrived in Arizona, attending proper schools and learning subjects she'd never had access to. The ranch itself had become something of a landmark in the region. The valley where Benjamin and Emma had struggled to build a cabin and survive their first year was now a thriving operation with additional outbuildings, expanded pastures, a proper barn, and orchards that produced fruit sold as far away as Phoenix. They'd hired help as they'd gotten older, young men and women looking for work who lived in a small bunkhouse Benjamin had built. But Emma and Benjamin still rose early every morning, still worked alongside their employees, still refused to be idle, even when their children begged them to slow down and rest. One spring morning, nearly 30 years after they'd first arrived in the valley, Emma woke to find the world transformed. A late-season storm had moved through during the night. Unseasonable, but not unheard of in the unpredictable Arizona weather. And snow covered everything. It was melting already in the warm spring sun. But for a few hours, the desert was transformed into a winter wonderland. Emma stood on the porch, watching the snow drip from the eaves, and memory crashed over her with unexpected force. Another snowstorm. Another time, a younger version of herself watching a man defend her honor with his fists, feeling her heart crack open with desire and possibility. Benjamin came to stand beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his weathered hands, and followed her gaze out over the snow-dusted valley. "You're remembering," he said. It wasn't a question. After 3 decades of marriage, he could read her like a book written in a language only he understood. That day at Fort McDowell, Emma confirmed, accepting the coffee and wrapping her hands around the warm cup. When you fought Lieutenant Morrison in the blizzard, when everything changed. Benjamin smiled, the expression transforming his lined face into something younger, showing hints of the man he'd been when Emma first met him. I couldn't help myself. Seeing him touch you, hearing what he said, something in me just snapped. I knew I was crossing lines, risking discipline, possibly ruining everything. But I didn't care. I would have fought an army for you that day. Emma leaned into his side, and his arm came around her automatically. The gesture as natural as breathing, after all these years. That was the moment I knew, she said softly. Watching you defend me. Seeing the fury in your face because someone had disrespected me. That was when I understood that what I felt for you was real. That it wasn't just attraction or loneliness or desperation. It was love. Benjamin pressed a kiss to the top of her head. His beard, now more gray than brown, tickling her forehead. I knew even before that, the moment you stepped off that stagecoach. Actually, I took one look at you and thought, that's her. That's the woman who's going to destroy my careful plans to live alone and die unmourned. That's the woman who's going to make me want to live again. They stood together watching the snow melt, remembering the young people they'd been, the risks they'd taken, the life they'd built. Would you do it again? Emma asked, a question she'd asked before but still liked hearing the answer to. Knowing what it cost, knowing how hard it would be. Benjamin turned her in his arms so they were face to face, his steel gray eyes, faded now, but still intense when they looked at her, meeting hers directly. Without hesitation, I'd pay double the cost. Triple. I'd give up everything I had 1,000 times over for one more day with you. Emma Carter. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. The only thing that ever really mattered. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, decades of love and gratitude swelling in her chest. I love you. I've loved you since that day in the blizzard. I'll love you until the day I die and probably beyond. Benjamin kissed her, soft and sweet. A kiss that held 30 years of partnership and passion and deep, abiding affection. When they separated, both of them were smiling, wrinkled and weather-worn, and completely, utterly content. That evening, their entire family gathered at the ranch for Sarah's birthday celebration. Children and grandchildren filled the house that had once been a half-finished cabin, filled it with laughter and noise and life. Emma moved through the chaos of food preparation and table setting and mediating small disputes between cousins, and felt her heart so full it ached. This was what she'd chosen. Not just Benjamin, though he was the foundation of everything, but this family, this community, this legacy of love that would continue long after she was gone. After dinner, as the sun set and the adults lingered over coffee while children played in the yard, Thomas stood and called for attention. Before everyone leaves, I wanted to say something. He looked at Emma and Benjamin with obvious emotion. Ma Pa, you gave us the greatest gift parents can give their children. You showed us what real love looks like, what real partnership means. You taught us that the best things in life are worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth choosing even when they're hard. He raised his coffee cup in a toast to the bravest woman I know, who chose love over security, and to the strongest man I know, who proved himself worthy of that choice every single day. To Ma and Pa, and the life they built that gave all of us a foundation to build our own lives on. The family echoed the toast, voices mixing together, and Emma found herself crying, Benjamin's hand tight around hers under the table. This was legacy. This was what mattered. Not wealth or social standing or the security she'd once thought so important. But this, family, and love, and the knowledge that the choice she'd made all those years ago had rippled outward, creating new lives and new love stories that would continue long after she was gone. Later, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Emma and Benjamin walked out to their favorite spot, a rise overlooking the valley where they could see the whole spread of land they'd claimed and tamed. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in silver light, and the air smelled of wet earth and new growth from the brief snow. "Do you remember what you said to me the first time we came here?" Emma asked. "When Miguel brought us to see the land." Benjamin thought for a moment. "I said it needed work, that it would be hard, that I couldn't offer you comfort or ease, but I could promise you that every day I would choose you." Emma nodded. "You kept that promise. Every single day for 30 years, you kept it. Even when things were hardest. Even when we lost the cattle in the drought of '79. Even when the children were sick and we thought we might lose Thomas to that fever. Even when..." Benjamin stopped her words with a gentle finger on her lips. "Every day, Emma. And I'll keep choosing you every day I have left, whether that's one more day or 20 more years." They stood together in the moonlight, two people who'd defied convention and propriety and common sense to choose love over everything else. Two people who'd built something beautiful and lasting from that impossible choice. And as Emma looked out over the valley they'd made their own, at the home they'd built with their own hands, at the legacy they'd created together, she felt nothing but profound gratitude. Gratitude for Benjamin, for the courage to choose him, for every hard day and every beautiful moment they'd shared. Gratitude for the life that had emerged from that single moment of bravery by a creek near Fort McDowell, when she'd said yes to passion instead of security. Gratitude for the family they'd raised, the land they'd tamed, the love that had only grown deeper with time. "Thank you," Emma whispered, not entirely sure if she was talking to Benjamin or to God or to fate itself. "Thank you for this life, for this love, for everything." Benjamin pulled her close, and they stood there under the Arizona stars, wrapped in each other's arms, exactly where they belonged. And if anyone had asked Emma in that moment whether she regretted leaving Fort McDowell all those years ago, whether she ever wished she'd married Captain Thornton and had that comfortable, secure life, Emma would have laughed. Laughed at the very idea that security without love could compete with love despite hardship. Laughed at the notion that ease mattered more than purpose. Laughed at the thought that she could be happier anywhere else, with anyone else, in any other life. Because this was her life. This man, this land, this love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. This partnership that had given her more joy in 30 years than some people found in a lifetime. This choice she'd made when she was 27 and desperate and brave enough to leap into the unknown. The moon rose higher, painting the desert in shades of silver and shadow, and Emma and Benjamin finally turned back toward their home. The home they'd built. The home they'd filled with love and children and decades of shared dreams and stubborn determination. As they walked, hand in hand like young lovers, though their hands were weathered and their steps slower than they once had been. Emma thought about the mail-order bride who'd never made it to her wedding, about the woman who'd chosen scandal and hardship over respectability and comfort, about the single moment of courage that had changed everything. And she smiled. Because sometimes, just sometimes, choosing your heart over your head was the smartest thing you could possibly do. Sometimes taking the risk was safer than playing it safe. Sometimes the impossible choice was the only real choice all along. Emma had learned all of that and more in her years with Benjamin. Had learned that love, real love, was worth any sacrifice. That partnership and purpose mattered more than ease. That building something with your own hands and heart gave a satisfaction that inherited comfort could never provide. As they reached their porch, and Benjamin held the door open for her with the old-fashioned courtesy he'd never abandoned, Emma paused and looked back one more time at the valley spread before them. Their valley, their home, their legacy. "I'd do it again," she said suddenly, and Benjamin looked at her with raised eyebrows. "The choice. By the creek. Leaving everything to be with you. If I could go back knowing everything I know now, I'd make the same choice. Without hesitation." Benjamin's smile was tender and understanding. "So would I, my love. So would I." They went inside together, closing the door on the silver night. And Emma felt a sense of completion, of rightness, settle over her like a blanket. This was how love stories were supposed to end. Not with dramatic rescues or impossible obstacles overcome, but with this: two people who'd chosen each other, day after day, year after year, until those choices had woven their lives together so completely that separation was unthinkable. Two people who'd proven that the brave choice, the hard choice, the choice that required sacrifice and courage, was also the choice that led to the deepest happiness. And as Emma and Benjamin prepared for bed in the room they'd shared for 3 decades, as Benjamin helped her with the buttons she could no longer manage easily, and Emma helped him with the boots that his stiff fingers struggled with, as they settled into bed and found their familiar positions with Emma's head on Benjamin's shoulder and his arms around her, Emma sent up one final prayer of gratitude for the blizzard that had brought them together, for the courage to choose him, for every hard day and every beautiful moment of the life they'd built, for this man who'd kept his promise to choose her every day, for this love that had sustained her through everything, for this life that had exceeded every dream she dared to dream. Outside, the last of the snow melted away, and spring reasserted itself in the desert. New flowers would bloom soon. New calves would be born. New life would continue the cycle that Emma and Benjamin had been part of for so long. And in their bed, two people who'd chosen love over everything else drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, exactly where they'd